The Zelensky piece is a complete mystery to me. That man and his regime are part and parcel of this whole sick MI6, CIA, Biden administration cabal that brought it into existence. Why President Trump gives a damn about any of that, why he's interested remotely, makes no sense at all. I think President Trump is interested in a meeting that makes a hero out of President Trump, where he can stand there and say, I have brought together Zelensky and Putin and we've made peace. No, it's not going to happen. The Russians are going to talk to Zelensky. They don't consider him remotely legitimate, nor should they. The question is, what does President Trump want? And he says he wants Zelensky present. And as far as I know, in this back and forth over the last several hours, the Russians have said absolutely not. And he said, Zelensky's not going to be there, then I can't meet with you, which, of course, is absurd because remember, Zelensky, along with this war in Ukraine, is not his war. Zelensky isn't necessarily his man. In fact, I'm still trying to figure out why President Trump didn't stand up, grab Zelensky by the scruff of his neck, and throw him out of the Oval Office when he was over here. I'm at a loss to figure out what's going on with President Trump, except to understand that in basic terms, he's a reality TV guy. He is a brilliant marketer, and he wants a meeting that's going to make him look great and his administration look great. The problem is I'm not sure he's going to get what he wants because the Russians are substantive. They're looking for a real outcome, and I think it's the larger strategic architecture that is of greatest interest to them because, frankly, from the Russian standpoint, this war in Ukraine is grinding to a very slow halt. And when it ends, it's going to end on their terms anyway. So there's not a whole hell of a lot to negotiate. So that's the first thing. So that's an absolute non-starter. Secondly, Ukraine has to be demilitarized. That is whatever remains of this Ukrainian state, what we call rump Ukraine. And I'm not sure that the current Ukrainian leadership is prepared to go along with that either. I'm unconvinced that there are only two demands, though. I listened to translated, of course, comments by Yushakov this morning, who was speaking for the government. I did not get the impression that all but those two demands had been brushed aside. President Trump probably was accustomed to doing in the New York City real estate game. In other words, you arrange for a meeting on the basis of assumptions that are then suddenly overturned once you agreed to the meeting. And there's no doubt that Witkoff probably said the president just wants to meet with you and wants to discuss a range of issues, and we think it's important to talk, and then ultimately leaves, and then later on it's announced we want Zelensky to be present. When the first meetings were held after Trump came to office in Saudi Arabia, Secretary Rubio said something that was true, that these meetings about normalizing relations with Moscow had gone very well. He was right, they had, and that was a truthful statement. My impression at that point from Secretary Rubio was that we were genuinely interested in a normalization of relations, quite apart from the whole issue in Ukraine. And there was a justifiable understanding in Trump's mind, at least at that point, that our relationship with Russia was far more important about any short-term goals we may have in Ukraine. That seems to have gone by the wayside. Now, where does Secretary Rubio stand? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out why Witkoff goes to Moscow and not Secretary Rubio. President Trump sat in the Oval Office and turned to Zelensky and said to him, you have no cards to play. Right now, President Trump in Ukraine has no cards to play. If telling Donahue to threaten war against Russia is the card he thinks he has to play, then he's lost his mind. Because the thing we need to keep in mind, if you go back through all these simulations that we have had over many years, and I'm talking about in my experience in the military when I was on active duty and since then, all of the ones that specifically were involved with the Soviet Union inevitably escalated to the nuclear level. And when they did, people concluded pretty accurately that once you hit that level, it was very difficult to control anything. And the notion that you could use a tactical nuclear weapon and be sure that everyone on the other side would know this is only tactical, as Colin Powell said at the time, I don't think you can drop a nuke on someone and then tell them this is a small one and not expect a response. It's just nonsense. I think we've reached the point where James Madison, and you're a better constitutional scholar than I am, I think it was in number 10, he said that they're trying to structure power in such a way in government to compensate or at least cope with the possibility that we will not, quote unquote, always have an enlightened man at the helm. The problem is we've reached a point where I don't think we have very many enlightened men. Anybody who talks casually, as this four-star did, this man Donahue, and another co-architect of the disaster in Afghanistan and its withdrawal, once you talk in those terms, you demonstrate that you've lost touch with reality. And the bad news for us, or I guess the good news for us, is that the Russians haven't, because Putin has bent over backwards to avoid these provocations leading to a nuclear exchange. That's the last thing that he wants, and he will do everything he can to avoid it. But at some point, he will lose patience if we persist along these lines. And I would not want that to happen. I think it would be better for us to now exercise some restraint and find a different way forward, negotiate intelligently. But first, if you're going to meet with the man, and this is something President Trump needs to understand, you have to have a larger strategic architecture in mind. It's not enough just to have a meeting and say, let's sort out Ukraine. No, let's sort it all out. Let's make it clear what our interests are. What are your interests? What are our interests? How do we make these harmonize? And if we can, then we can avoid future conflict. That ought to be the goal. I don't hear anybody saying that. President Trump is someone who believes threats and bullying work. I think this is the product of his New York City life experience and the real estate market. And frankly, if you look at the White House right now and the people running things and surrounding Trump, it looks like the New York City delegation is running our country. So it may be that everyone is of one mind, that threatening and bullying is an inherently good idea and that it works. The administration is flailing, and I think they are ultimately failing right now. And that becomes more and more evident with each passing day. And you can go across the range of issues. There is no strategy for rounding up, evaluating, and expelling illegal aliens. There's nothing going on there. The stuff that happens is all impulse-driven. I see no evidence for a serious effort to deal with the problem on a national level. That's one example. You can go through a number of them, but I think when it comes to our overseas presence, everything is impulse-driven with President Trump. There is no strategy. I have never detected any strategy. When he took over as president, I think he's behaved as he has in the past. Now I'm in charge. Everybody has to do what I say. These are my ideas. We're going to go forward and implement them. And when he runs into opposition, he usually backs down. Then he tries something else. In other words, there is no coherent strategic framework that guides the application of military power or a national industrial policy. You see the same thing with the tariffs. Everyone who opposes me and what I want to do to Russia will have to face 100% tariffs. Then they suddenly back down and say, no, only 25% tariffs. The next question is, why tariffs at all? We're going to punish you, India, with whom we've had friendly relations for a long time, that is known to have good relations with Russia. In fact, India is a state you would turn to for help and assistance in communicating your desires, your goals, and interests to Russia. It's not a state that I would offend or alienate, but that's what we've done. And so Mr. Modi has said, thank you very much. We're not interested. Go fly a kite. The Japanese have said, we're going to buy all the oil and gas we want from Russia. It's all part of the same thing. There is no coherent strategy with attainable political military objectives. None. That Germany, for instance, commit national suicide, and it's well on its way. The problem, though, is that there's a real war brewing in Europe, a major war. But it's not with Russia. It's with the millions and millions of non-Europeans that were herded into those countries since 2015. That's what everybody's afraid of. They should be afraid of it because it's a catastrophe for Europe. And it's obvious in Italy. It's obvious in Germany or Austria or France or anywhere you go, and especially now in England. That's the truth. Nobody in these countries is interested in going to war with Russia. And the fear factor is diminishing as more and more people figure out. I think the sad truth of the matter is as follows. For the Russians, I think they finally figured out whatever we say, they can't believe. It's just a lie. And they've given up on us. So they'll be polite to us and they'll smile, but they'll continue doing their work. And I think they figured out they're going to have to move west. They're going to have to cross the river. They have to go into Kiev and go into Odessa. and be prepared for whatever happens after that, at least until the governments in Western Europe change hands. That will be a strategic sea change. And then the truth will come out. It'll look like de-Stalinization or denazification when that comes. And these narratives are spun up in London and in Langley, and then they're disseminated to the press. And you have others that are more expert on this than I am, whether it's Phil Giraldi or John Mearsheimer or any other numbers of people that are familiar with the intelligence sources for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. And these papers just mindlessly reprint this nonsense. It has no basis in fact. It's complete fantasy. They've concluded that if this war in Ukraine ends anytime soon, they're out of office. Because as soon as it becomes clear that the Russians have won decisively, as soon as it becomes obvious that we in the United States, our government is no longer interested in funding it or can't, the game is up for them. They have bet everything on the war in Ukraine to ensure their authority is unchecked. And that's what they've got right now. And so I think they were willing to say and do almost anything for Trump, provided he keeps sending weapons, keeps sending money, and keeps troops on the ground along the border in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. So I think that's what it's all about. I don't think it's going to work. I think it's all going to fall apart. It'll probably fall apart sooner rather than later. But again, it's all based on this false assumption. And all you have to, I live 65 miles west of D.C., but all I have to do is go into Washington, go to any of the think tanks, which of course are oxymorons. They're all dominated by the same people that are all also pushing war in the Middle East or war with China and war everywhere. And they say the same thing. Oh, Russia is weak. We just do this a little longer, just a few more months. Russia will fall. They're weak. And oh, Putin, he's just a dictator. People are ready to overthrow him. He's weak. Wrong. It's all nonsense. And of course, it's all predicated on the great myth that we're this perfect liberal democracy. Even though most Americans are concluding with each passing day, the ballot box is broken. And it doesn't make any difference whom you vote for. You end up with the same policies. And if you look at Trump and what he said before he was elected, what he's done since he got there, two things worlds apart. There was an article that was penned by this former Russian general, Dmitry Trin, then published ultimately on the website at RT. And he does a good job of addressing this and essentially repeating something that Putin has largely said. It doesn't make any difference what we do. It doesn't make any difference what we say. We're going to continue to be the target of abuse for the West in perpetuity. And so we might as well get accustomed to it. Don't look for any change in sanctions or economic policy and prepare to fight the long war, if you will. So I think that's really what this is all about. And again, go back to candidate Trump and the kinds of things he said when he was running for office. And they're 180 degrees out from the things that he's now doing. I think he's being handed a script by his handlers, the people that represent his donors, and told this is what you're going to do. And I think he likes threatening other countries, other people. It's his nature. He thinks bullying works. The Russians in general, the Soviets certainly were. The Tsarist Russians were worried about it. I think Putin is very acutely sensitive to it, and that's this issue of civilian control. Who is really in control? And I think it conveys the impression to the Russians, unfortunately, that the civilians are not in control. I read a comment the other day from the general that was in charge of the Manhattan Project, Leslie Groves. And he went to his fellow generals in the army at the time after the atom bomb was dropped, and he said, I know you're talking about control of atomic weapons. Gentlemen, these are not military weapons. These aren't cannon. These are not rifles. All of these weapons should be under exclusively civilian control at all times because they're eminently political in character. And you know what? Everybody agreed. And you know how we know that happened? Because we read the statements that he made after he was retired in his memoir. What I'm trying to tell you is nobody said that publicly.
Right.
It happened behind closed doors. And this was true with Marshall during the Second World War. There were many times when he strongly disagreed with the guidance he was getting from FDR. And he made his views known, and then he saluted, went out and executed. Did we know about that during the war? Absolutely. And they're happy with what they think is the impact. The assumption that you get somewhere in international relations and in certainly state-to-state relations between Russia and ourselves by bullying or attempting to bully and threaten the Russians. It's absolutely crazy. It's incomprehensible. And the sad part is we're also doing this from a very weakened position. We're in no position to go toe-to-toe with the Russians, certainly not in Eastern Europe, not on the continent. So why would he make these kinds of statements? Why would he invite the possibility that if the Russians feel threatened enough, that they might do something to protect Kaliningrad? It's a very short distance from Belarusia. It is not difficult to move from Belarusia straight across this gap that exists in Poland and Lithuania between Kaliningrad and Belarusia. Why would you invite such a thing? That causes a major war to break out. It's not well thought out. It's more, as I said, this is Bill O'Reilly quality thinking and policy making. Bloviate, stand up and make incautious remarks and foolish statements that garner attention on the assumption that somehow or another this does anybody any good. And any professional soldier that I'm familiar with in the German military, certainly in the Polish military, that would hear this, I would think they'd be horrified. But who knows? I don't know what the quality today is of the NATO forces leadership. Certainly it's not what it was back in the 1990s. That's obvious. First of all, military professionals, as a rule, do not speak publicly on these matters of policy. Saying we can overrun and take Kaliningrad, which is the portion of East Prussia that Stalin awarded, or FDR awarded to Stalin towards the end of the war, is what he's talking about. And it's a sad and tragic legacy of the Second World War that this little spot was retained by the Soviets and then subsequently was inherited when Russia became Russia, because it's a permanent catalyst for conflict to some extent, because the Poles, Lithuanians don't like it. The Germans, they lost the war. So at least their view is we lost the war. We lost all of this territory. There's nothing we can do about it. But for him to stand up and say these things, first of all, he's inflating our capabilities to do everything that he outlines, which is not unusual, but it's always a bad idea. But more important, he's communicating an intent. And sadly, I think this aligns with President Trump and probably Secretary Hegseth and his deputy, Mr. Feinberg. This is anti-Russian. This is threatening to Russia. And in their minds, they think this is somehow or another reinforcing the end of the coming deadline. Now, we can talk about Donahue as where he came from and what he's known for, which is pretty disturbing given his past that he would end up at this 4-star level. But again, when there is no accountability, Judge, there is no performance. Now, why would he then have ended up in Europe? Before he got to Europe as a 4-star, he was heavily involved in advising the Ukrainians on how to fight the Russians. And he seems to have played a key role in this amphibious assault across the Dnieper River in Kherson. And it was a catastrophe. It cost the Ukrainians virtually the entire force they used. It made no sense. We couldn't define what the objective was. And he is viewed as this loyal servant of greater Ukraine, as well as the United States. And so everyone welcomes him back to Europe because he's anti-Russian. This sort of thing is worse than bad. It's catastrophic.